the specifics are that I think it's now the 3 Russian tankers have been hit in the last 2 weeks, and the one that was hit yesterday was critically damaged. So yeah, how's that working out for you? And then also the wider issue that you raised, and I'm glad you picked up that report. I just wrote about it about an hour ago, is that Russian oil exports are at their lowest point for November, going all the way back to 2016. There is another report this week that puts the estimate that Russia's oil exports are down 33% since January. I've seen other projections, which is with the continuing effect of the U.S. sanctions that were just adopted on Lukoil and Rosneft and on their customers, and with the Ukrainian attacks, we could be talking about Russian oil revenues being down 50% by December.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Thank you. It is so good to see both of you today.
U.S. President Donald Trump has given Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy just days to accept U.S. peace plan. Meanwhile, Financial Times reported that also Ukraine is stuck between demands on territory it can't accept and U.S. side it can't reject. How close are we to a deal, and what is your assessment of the current trajectory of these negotiations?
Well, just a reminder, well, 2 reminders. First, if you want to know how close we are to a deal, you need to be speaking to Mr. Putin, which may not be possible, but he's the barrier to a deal. I mean, that just needs to be restated. If Mr. Putin tomorrow agreed to a ceasefire, stopped his attacks on the ground and on the air in Ukraine, including upon civilians, including upon good people like yourself, then that would be a stop. That would be a halt to the invasion. And then we could discuss the specific territorial terms, political, military, and economic. But of course, he's not going to agree to a ceasefire unless Ukraine surrenders more territory and surrenders its sovereignty in the sense of having control of its military, political, and economic affairs. The second point is, since you mentioned Mr. Trump, is that you always have to cut through Mr. Trump's rhetoric to get to the reality of what's happening. I mean, this is the guy who said, when he returned to the White House in January, the war will be over in 24 hours, and then he said a few weeks ago, oh, I have my magical peace plan and the war will be over by Thanksgiving, the end of November. And now some of his officials are leaning on President Zelenskyy to give them a peace plan by Christmas. In other words, that Ukraine make concessions so that Trump can declare it. I think it's far more useful to start with the state of where we are with the 2 competing proposals that are out there, and to see where they may be meeting, they may be converging. I mean, the first is the Kremlin plan that was devised with Donald Trump's envoys, with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner at the end of October. We've talked about it before, but as a reminder, the fundamental there is that Ukraine, under that plan, to give up all of Donetsk in the east of the country, including that strategic 20 to 22% that Ukraine holds, that Ukraine needs to hold to protect other areas such as the highway to Kyiv. That's a plan that permanently bars Ukraine from NATO, that sharply restricts Ukraine troop levels, restricts Western assistance to Ukraine, gives the U.S. 50% of profits from Ukraine's recovery funds, and in the meantime allows the Russians to have the sanctions lifted, to go back into the G8 if they want, and it gives them amnesty for war crimes. Now, there's a lot of things that just aren't acceptable there. So you have the European counterproposal that was worked out with Kyiv, which is you start with a ceasefire. That's the starting point. You work with a ceasefire. And then, for example, you can discuss Ukraine's membership, but you can't permanently ban it. You can discuss military aid to Ukraine, but it has to be part of security guarantees, firm security guarantees for Ukraine. You can discuss the recovery fund, but it can't be based on the U.S. taking 50% of the profits. Ukraine's recovery fund is for Ukraine's reconstruction. And you can talk about lifting the sanctions on Russia, but only when they comply with the conditions. And you cannot just give them a blanket amnesty or war crimes when you have a president of Russia who is wanted over the deportations of Ukrainian children. He's wanted by the International Criminal Court. Okay, so where are we? Okay, where we are is that as I speak to you, I'm speaking to you on a Thursday, is that Europe and President Zelenskyy are pushing back against that faction in the Trump administration that wants to make them surrender. And that's the vice president, J.D. Vance, that's definitely Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, and to an extent it has been Jared Kushner. Now, what they do is they just leak information or they leak claims to the media. And what we found out is that they were really pushing Zelenskyy, as I mentioned, to just give up resisting the demands by Christmas, December 25th, in the U.S. The other faction in the Trump administration pushed back against that. Now, this is the faction that says, no, you cannot just simply walk away from Ukraine and Europe's security. And they push back by saying, look, these demands have been made on Zelenskyy, and getting the press to say, is this really proper that these demands are made? And that faction that's pushing back against just giving away to the Kremlin probably includes the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as the career officials in the agencies, the military, State Department, Treasury, intelligence services. Now, the interesting development as I speak to you, there's two interesting developments. The first is that in combination, because of this division within the Trump administration, where some people are working with the Kremlin, and also this horrible document called a national security strategy, which effectively calls for the breakup of the European Union and undermining European governments, European leaders have been pushing back against the Trump administration this week. They have been saying, look, why are you trying to get rid of the alliance that we've had since World War II? And Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, is saying we may not be able to count on this alliance. We may have to make ourselves self-sufficient in Europe. When Pope Leo met President Zelenskyy on Tuesday in the Vatican, he made it very clear that he saw this document, this U.S. document, and Trump's statements as being very damaging to the alliance with Europe. Now, why is that broad picture important? Because it opens up space where Europe and Zelenskyy tried to take the initiative on the proposals. And on Wednesday night, in Kyiv, Zelenskyy and Ukrainian advisors spoke with the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and Jared Kushner. Remember, the same Jared Kushner who had been working with the Kremlin. And they spoke also to a man named Larry Fink. Now, he's important because he's the head of one of America's biggest investment firms, BlackRock. That discussion on recovery and reconstruction was also a way of playing back to Trump by saying, look, don't pursue joint economic projects with the Russians. If you can get us a ceasefire, you can work with us on economic projects. There is money to be made out of Ukraine's reconstruction. There's money to be made out of Ukraine's recovery. Okay, you can make money, President Trump, but you have to have a ceasefire. There is no way that you can make money out of Ukraine if the war is continuing. And that is really the position that we were in back in August, if you remember. Back in August, when Vladimir Putin went in and spoke to Donald Trump in Alaska, he overplayed his hand. He said, give me all of Donetsk, give me all of that. And Ukraine and Europe went to Trump in the White House and said, look, rare earth minerals, energy projects, investment projects, we know they're important to you, but you can't do that if Putin's continuing to just demand more and more territory. And you might remember that between August and October, that gave Ukraine and Europe the space to have the diplomatic high ground. Then, of course, the Kremlin hit back. That's when they were maneuvering with Witkoff and with Kushner. It's difficult, and I'm sorry, because we would love to have an easy answer which says peace is around the corner. But the reality here is you have two competing proposals. until you can find a way to take the best out of those proposals and the best for Ukraine out of those proposals, and until you can convince the Kremlin to accept that and to ceasefire, we have to prepare for a winter where the attacks continue, but where you have to keep not just Europe, but the adults in the room, the people in the Trump administration who are the adults in the room, you've got to keep them in support of Kyiv. Because the risk here is that the faction, which is J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, they will try to cut the U.S. supply of military weapons via NATO to Ukraine, and they will try to cut the intelligence sharing, both of which have been restored since the summer to help Ukraine defend itself.
That also covers this matter of Donbass. According to the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, Donbass is the most difficult matter in these negotiations. Russia is demanding Ukraine to surrender Donbass, and U.S. negotiators have tested several so-called formulas to make this concession appropriate for President Zelenskyy, including a proposal to create a demilitarized zone in case of Ukraine's withdrawal from Donbass. However, U.S. does not demand Russia to withdraw their own troops from Donbass area, from this so-called demilitarized zone. What is your take on this matter, on U.S. trying to sell this to President Zelenskyy?
I think, first of all, it's important to highlight where this came from. David Ignatius is a longtime columnist for the Washington Post. And the importance here is David Ignatius's columns usually are what U.S. officials want to be put out publicly. He has very good contacts in the State Department. He has good contacts in other agencies. And my question here is, who fed this information to Ignatius? I think it may be the State Department. I wouldn't rule it out possibly being a faction around Kushner. The reason why I say that is that they are trying to present this as a compromise proposal between Ukraine continuing to maintain full control of the rest of Donetsk and Russia being allowed to seize Donetsk. Now, I'm going to say, first of all, that the proposal for a demilitarized zone, and if I remember correctly, it's a 30-kilometer deep zone. So that 30 kilometers, well, first of all, that means Russia doesn't have control of that zone. Will the Kremlin accept it? And then, as you mentioned, it means Ukraine doesn't control more of its territory. Would they accept it? But there's a third question here, which is who patrols that zone? Who's if you have a demilitarized zone, someone has to patrol the zone to enforce it, right? Because what happens if the Russians decide they want to seize the territory? And we know that the U.S. has said it's not going to provide troops. We know that Russia objects to European forces, indeed any foreign forces being inside Ukraine. So who patrols that zone? Who provides the security? So it's a nice thought bubble, and I would say that it is quite possible that this is part of a revised proposal which has gone to President Zelenskyy. But at least for now, I don't think it's viable. And it's, again, I'm going to say it's certainly not viable unless you have a ceasefire first. I mean, it's absolute nonsense to say, oh, let's discuss having a demilitarized zone while Russia's continuing its attacks. And there's no incentive for Russia to discuss a demilitarized zone while they are continuing to attack. Why should they agree to a demilitarized zone if they think they can seize the territory? So again, yeah, it's interesting that someone in the U.S. government is floating this as an idea, but I wouldn't consider this as being something on the verge of being accepted at this point. No way.
Another interesting topic, and Donald Trump also pointed it on his interview to Politica, and actually Ukrainian president has already responded. It's about elections. And Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that Ukraine could be ready to hold elections during this full-scale war only if US and European partners help ensure security. How do you read this message from Ukrainian president?
Yeah, Sofia, thank you for mentioning the whole bit of this, because some people only mentioned Donald Trump's demand that there be elections, and again, insulting Zelensky by implying he was illegitimate as a president. Then they only mentioned that Zelensky said, oh, I will have elections within 60 to 90 days. You know, the important condition that you just said there is, okay, if our security is guaranteed, then we can have elections. Then I can approach Parliament because I need a constitutional change, which would allow the elections to be held. Because even with the security guarantees, if Russia has not ceasefired, you're still under martial law. So what Zelensky did is he put the ball back in Trump's court, as I put it. And that is, you want me to have elections? Give me U.S. security guarantees, which, of course, that Trump faction working with the Kremlin has been holding out against. So I think as a tactical move, Zelensky handled it exactly as it should be. And I will hasten to add, I think the question of elections is an important one for the Ukrainian people. They will need to decide it. But my understanding here is twofold. One is that most Ukrainian people recognize that you currently cannot have elections under the conditions in which you're living. And secondly, they recognize at the same time that they value the freedom to decide who they might vote for in elections. And as I understand it, the most recent opinion poll is 20% of people favor Zelensky in a first ballot, whereas 19% favor the former commander-in-chief, General Zelenskyy, which shows you, by the way, in contrast to Russia, where I don't think Vladimir Putin would face a legitimate challenger, that in the middle of wartime, Ukrainians are still talking about a functioning democracy, which is something that the Kremlin's propaganda that Trump continues to amplify does not recognize.
Also, in this interview, President Trump said that Moscow had the upper hand in negotiations, and the CNN in parallel reports that there are no new US or European assessments showing major battlefields changes, and they see no indications that Putin's forces are poised for a quick victory. So the question is, why President Donald Trump is so pessimistic again?
Well, first of all, I don't know how this translates into Ukrainian, but this is a phrase from my grandfather. Donald Trump doesn't know diddly squat about Ukraine. He doesn't know anything about Ukraine. He doesn't know anything about your culture. He doesn't know anything about your political system. He doesn't know anything about the military situation. So what Donald Trump does is Donald Trump's always, I want to be on the side of the winners. I think we've discussed this before. Back in the spring, when he didn't like President Zelensky very much, Russia was winning. In the summer, remember, when Europe and Zelensky had the upper hand politically, he said, Russia is not doing well. Russia could be losing. Now, because of the Kremlin proposal, and because Zelensky won't accept the Kremlin proposal, now all of a sudden Russia is winning again. And of course, this is the line that's been fed to him in his ear by people like Steve Witkoff. I mean, this is what happens here. I just want to make clear what happens here is the Kremlin has a propaganda line. It goes through Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's chief economic advisor. Dmitriev puts it out on social media. Steve Witkoff thinks Kirill Dmitriev is wonderful. Dmitriev back in the spring would show him around. Look, St. Petersburg is wonderful. Moscow is wonderful. So anytime Kirill Dmitriev says something, Witkoff goes and tells it to Trump. That's what happens here. Now, what is the reality versus what is said here? I mean, the reality here is, and I had kept saying, you know, Russia had about 18% of Ukraine was occupied in 2022, at the end of 2022. It's now up to around about 19.5%. The Institute for the Study of War estimated somewhere about 0.9% of Ukrainian territory has been taken by Russia this year, at a cost this year in 2025 of 400,000 Russian casualties. Russia has gained 1 square kilometer. To get 1 square kilometer of Ukraine, Russia has lost 85 troops, right? Why is that important? Russia has taken less than 1% this year. They still have not taken Pokrovsk after 17 months. So this key town in Donetsk. and they say they're winning, at the rate of advance they're making, they might take the rest of Donetsk in the next 5 years if their economy can sustain this. So no, if I was to look at this both in terms of the limited gains on the battlefield, the state of the Russian economy, the Ukrainian counterattacks on Russia, and they just knocked out another major oil installation overnight, this winning-losing formula is ridiculous, and the media should not repeat it. The media should not repeat it. What they should say here is, we have in effect a conflict where there is very little movement on the ground. There is very little prospect of a breakthrough by either side. Both sides are suffering. So the question here is, can you get a ceasefire on the basis of the current lines? Any reasonable analysis would do that instead of falling into the winning versus losing trap.
Let's also continue to cover this Trump's interview with Politico. He expressed frustration with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy again, quote, "He's going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things, you know, when you are losing." This is what President Trump said, Politico's reporter, and this is something different compared to what we heard 2 months ago after a meeting between President Zelenskyy and Trump in UN, when he told reporters that Ukraine could liberate all occupied territories. What is your take on this, and could we also hear another attitude from Trump in the upcoming weeks, when he can again repeat his statements that Ukraine can win this war in 1 or 2 months?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because he's a bully. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this to you again. I just said that he doesn't know anything about Ukraine. So let's just say he's always been a bully when he's a businessman, which covers up the fact that he's not a very effective businessman. I could talk to you about the 6 bankruptcies. He's a bully as a presidential candidate, where he just gives people these insulting nicknames. He was a bully when he stalked Hillary Clinton around the debate stage in 2016. And he's a bully as president, or he tries to be a bully. So he insults President Zelenskyy. So go back to the start of this year when he comes into office. I'm going to have a settlement within 24 hours. How's he going to get it? I'm going to talk to Russia, and I'm going to claim that President Zelenskyy is a dictator. He called him a dictator. Now, I mean, that's really rich, calling Zelenskyy a dictator when Donald Trump has been good friends with Vladimir Putin. But he calls Zelenskyy a dictator, and he says only 4% of Ukrainians support him, when the true figure at that point was that Zelenskyy had an approval rating of between 60 and 65%. Well, Zelenskyy didn't give way, to his credit. Well, during the summer, as you mentioned, and as we were talking about with Sofia there, when you get the adults in the room that tell him, look, Ukraine's not losing, it is Putin who is trying to humiliate you by continuing to attack civilians and refusing the ceasefire, then all of a sudden it became, oh, Zelenskyy is a good guy. He's defending his country, but I'm worried about Russia. Now what happens here is Witkoff and Kushner go to him in October and say, we've got a plan. We've got a plan with the Russians. We could get you that Nobel Peace Prize. And now Trump's like, oh, Zelensky's the barrier to it. Not Putin. Zelensky's the barrier to it. So what does he do? He becomes the bully again. He's losing. Why doesn't he lose? Why doesn't he recognize? And that raises an interesting moment, because I always like to bring Europe back into the discussion, because it doesn't mean that you simply are powerless in front of a bully. Trump has another phrase, which is that Zelenskyy had, and you know this one in Ukraine. Every Ukrainian knows this. Zelenskyy has no cards, right? He has no cards versus the Russians. If you noticed on Monday, when the European leaders showed support in the meeting with Zelenskyy in London, this was the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, the French President Emmanuel Macron. Macron said, we have the cards. And he mentioned specifically Russia's economy. Now, that's an important statement. It's an important statement because it shows that European leaders believe they still can put pressure on Russia. And secondly, it's a message back to Trump. Don't you think that we are powerless here? We may discuss this a little bit later. Beyond this, is probably the biggest crisis in U.S.-European relations since 1945. Because the Trump camp, Trump and those close advisors, do not believe in an alliance with Europe. So those European leaders are talking back to Trump and saying, okay, if you want to insult Zelensky, you want to insult Ukraine, you are also threatening us. Let's be very clear. You are threatening European security. And I think we're going to have a winter where it's going to be a question of standing up to Trump, the bully, not just on behalf of Ukrainian security, but European security. And you know me, I tend to be, if I look at the glass, I tend to look half full. That I think if you push Europe into that position, Europe will step up its support of Ukraine, precisely because they do not want to give way to Trump.
You just mentioned about this matter of cards. Who does have the cards right now? Europeans, Russians, Ukrainians. It's interesting that Russian oil exports in November were the lowest in recent years as Western sanctions and Ukrainian drones disrupted tankers and export terminals. According to Financial Times, analysts warn that if the pressure persists, Russia could face deeper structural constraints on its ability to sell cheap oil to global markets. Does it mean that Putin is losing his cards right now, begun to lose his most expensive, most valuable oil cards?
Yeah. Let me just say, first of all, in light with our previous answer, to Donald Trump and to all those great people that leave comments for us below our videos, how's that Russia's winning looking line working out for you, right? When you look at what you just mentioned, the specifics are that I think it's now the 3 Russian tankers have been hit in the last 2 weeks, and the one that was hit yesterday was critically damaged. So yeah, how's that working out for you? And then also the wider issue that you raised, and I'm glad you picked up that report. I just wrote about it about an hour ago, is that Russian oil exports are at their lowest point for November, going all the way back to 2016. There is another report this week that puts the estimate that Russia's oil exports are down 33% since January. I've seen other projections, which is with the continuing effect of the U.S. sanctions that were just adopted on Lukoil and Rosneft and on their customers, and with the Ukrainian attacks, we could be talking about Russian oil revenues being down 50% by December. And there's a fundamental here. I'm not saying that this means that Russia loses. I'm not saying this means that the economy completely collapses, but it constrains the Russian invasion. If you do not have 50% of your oil revenues, or even a third of your oil revenues, then it becomes an additional problem for your economy. And the Russian GDP is already stagnant. Inflation officially is around the 10% mark, but unofficially, according to the LSE, working with Ukrainian and European researchers, it's between 20 and 25%. Which means that Russia's real wages are not increasing. Russia is facing shortages in certain key manufacturing areas. The Russian financial system has got problems with bad loans. Russia's agricultural sector, food production in Russia declined this year in the past few months for the first time since 2009. So for the first time in 16 years, food output's down. Why is that? Partly because of problems in the agricultural sector with equipment, and partly because Russian consumers aren't eating as much food. So you tell me that this is a wartime economy which is winning. It just adds to this gap between projection and illusion, or projection and reality, because the Kremlin will continue to project that it's winning. It will continue to say, economically, we can handle this, no problem here. The special military operation continues. The fact here is that there are cracks that are appearing in terms of maintaining this. And I'll just refer to our great viewers to another fact which has just come out. In certain parts of Russia now, you're not seeing the bonuses and the military benefits being given either to troops or to their families of troops who have been slain. Those benefits are starting to be cut. And I'll refer you to another fact. The 2026 budget in Russia sharply decreases the percentage of money spent on social services. Now, you may say Russians are happy with that. They'll sacrifice social welfare programs for that. But fact is that it does make it more difficult for Russia to keep prosecuting the invasion, even if they step up the military share of the budget to, I think, 38%.
Another main topic of the week, I would say, it's also the new security strategy of the US. And we actually already heard some critics argue that this strategic signals that Washington is no longer firmly aligned with Europe or even Ukraine. What's your take on the new security strategy?
Okay. I've got a few things to say, but before I say that, don't just take it from me. The Danish government has said that the United States is now a threat to Europe. They're not even calling the U.S. It's not even the fact that it's not an ally. It's a threat to Europe. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, when he met with the other leaders, when he met Volodymyr Zelenskyy on Monday, and then he repeated it on Tuesday, he said, look, we can't count on the Americans. We have to, as Europe, we have to be self-sufficient almost, economically, militarily, politically. Pope Leo, when he talked to President Zelenskyy on Tuesday, said this national security strategy threatens to break the alliance that we've had for almost 80 years. And Donald Trump's statements threaten that. So it's not just me. I mean, European leaders are looking at that document with a great deal of shock, even given the chaos and unpredictability of the Trump administration. So let's break this down for Ukraine and for Europe. You have that Trump faction which does not believe in an alliance with Europe. And that includes J.D. Vance, the vice president. It includes Steve Witkoff. It includes other political appointees, sometimes young political appointees who are very much hard right. Let's say, first of all, the U.S. has a far-right government now. And I know what far-right means, and you know what far-right means, and you know how important it is, that label. The U.S. has a far-right government right now. And I say that in part not only because they break the alliance with Europe, but of the reason they give for breaking it. The reason they give for breaking it is a conspiracy theory, which is called the Great Replacement. This has been whipped up by far-right activists, especially in the past 15 years when we've had to deal with the issue of rising migration and refugees and asylum seekers, including refugees from Ukraine. The Great Replacement theory says that white European countries are being overrun by non-white people, migrants, refugees. It was very much a fringe theory until the era of Donald Trump in the United States. It was a few people like his friend, the Fox TV personality Tucker Carlson, who used to push it. The document, the National Security Strategy, says that Europe is facing civilizational erasure. Your civilization will be erased because migrants are going to overwhelm you. That is racist. It is racist. It is, although the document doesn't mention religion, it's also probably Islamophobic, referring to Muslims. It is white nationalist. Now, when you have a government which has effectively now come out as far right, who does it look at as its allies? The document says the European Union must be broken up. And it gives all types of silly reasons. Supposedly, the European Union is the censor, for example, because it fines Elon Musk for inciting or allowing posts that incite violence and for not verifying accounts. So apparently the European Union is a greater threat to the United States than Russia is, because with Russia, you have a strategic realignment. So if the European Union should be broken up, how do you do it? You ally yourself, and this is what the document says, with far-right movements in Europe. It calls them European nationalists. Those far-right movements will include Alliance for Deutschland in Germany, whom You might remember in February when J.D. Vance insulted Europe, said that the U.S. no longer wanted to work with Europe, that he immediately met with the AfD leader, Elisa Weidel. So the Trump administration will work with AfD. They will work with Viktor Orban in Hungary, whom I know you all know very, very well, as an obstacle to the support of Ukraine. They will look to work with the far right in France, the National Rally. They will promote the far right UK Reform Party and try to get rid of the Labour government. And if an early draft of the document is right, they also think that there's vulnerabilities. They can work with far right movements in Italy, Austria, and Poland. So this was a project of certain Trump advisors in the first Trump term, notably a man named Steve Bannon. This is now a project of a group of people around Donald Trump, which is, we don't believe in working with European democratic nations or with the EU. We work with movements because we think that their version of white nationalism should be supported, or because we think we can make money. That's the other incentive in the national security strategy, is to make money. And the reason why the national security strategy tilts towards Russia, because we can make money out of Russia. So what does all that mean? It's not just Ukrainian security that's at stake here. It is European security as well. And I'm just being very serious for a moment about this, because, I always worry about Trump because he's unpredictable, he's chaotic. But the thing about Trump is, because he's unpredictable and chaotic, he might change his mind and do something else. These are people who are not Donald Trump who are behind this strategy. And that means we have a serious problem, which is, even if Donald Trump was gone tomorrow, these white nationalists in the United States would be pursuing this very different foreign policy, which doesn't mean that we protect each other. It means they try to dominate us for the sake of profits or the sake of their very particular ideological vision.
Scott Lucas, thank you very much for this conversation and for your insights, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Thank you, Daniel. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Likewise.